Hi, thanks for joining me today here at BCBA Talks. I'm Tiana, I'm a BCBA, and this is my very first YouTube video ever, so please excuse any technological mishaps or anything like that. It's going to get better, okay, eventually. The answer to my clickbait question is yes, ABA reform is desperately needed, and it's a topic that I'm very passionate about, so I decided to make this video to talk about why it's needed and what it looks like. I'm not coming up with it. This is something that's already going on in the field, but it's going pretty slowly. I think it's really important to get the word out to not only providers and to RBTs and other behavior techs, but also to parents to know what they can expect out of ABA and what ABA is supposed to look like. So, I've been in ABA for about 7 years now, and I honestly wholeheartedly believe in the science of it. I love the concepts, I love the application of those concepts to different behaviors and skills and contexts and settings and individuals and situations. It's very helpful, it's effective, and it can do so much for families. But unfortunately, our application of it, especially as it relates to our work with the autistic population, leaves a lot to be desired sometimes. So the number one thing that needs to change is how much we actually listen to autistic people. Personally, I work with mostly individuals with moderate to severe disabilities, and a lot of the time that includes a significant communication deficit. So my clients most of the time can't tell me how they feel about the therapy that we're doing with words. So they tell me how they can. They tell me with their behavior. That might look like crying or tantrums or aggression or leaving the area that we're in, or refusing to move, or resistance to being physically touched. And unfortunately, a lot of the times in ABA, we just label those problem behavior and we try to reduce them via something called escape extinction or extinction in general, which is basically not allowing that to happen. So, for example, if a child is engaging in a tantrum to try to get out of an activity we're doing, we would just continue doing the activity throughout the tantrum. So, this intervention is very effective in reducing the problem behavior, but for the wrong reasons. The child just eventually learns, okay, my communication attempts are not heard, they're not respected, they're not tolerated, so they just eventually give up. And I think that's super sad. If you're an ABA professional or if you are a parent looking for services, I would really urge you to go to Google and just look up some experiences from autistic adults who have been through ABA and what they have to say about this type of compliance-based therapy. Spoiler alert, it's not pretty. This type of compliance-based therapy often causes trauma and like straight up PTSD. I feel like some professionals in the field tend to dismiss these claims or not really take them seriously. Number one, because a lot of the time the people who make these claims don't really know ABA. And then sometimes I feel like it comes from this almost condescending place of like, well, you have autism, so you don't really know what's best for you, which I don't agree with. Then we don't listen to the individuals that show us with their behavior that they are not enjoying the therapy and they don't want to be there. And then we also don't listen to the individuals that have been through it and can tell us with words that they didn't enjoy the experience and they feel like they didn't gain a lot from it. And in fact, they feel like it harmed them. And I think that's really disappointing considering the fact that for us as ABA professionals, the quality of life of the individuals that we serve should be our number one priority. So practicing person-first therapy instead of this type of compliance-based therapy that I just gave an example of means that our clients' safety, their dignity, their wants and their needs, and their quality of life comes before what the teacher wants or what the class needs or what the community wants, or in a lot of cases, even what the parent wants. And this is tricky because, of course, most parents just want their kids to be happy and safe and loved and grow up with a lot of great social opportunities and really be able to fully participate in their community and their family. But if that involves teaching uncomfortable or unsafe things like forcing compliance, forcing eye contact, forcing these typical interactions with their environment, it's our job as professionals to really have the parents take a step back and take a look at the big picture, which is that, Yeah, although it's possible for kids who enter therapy really early and have intensive therapy to be able to pass as neurotypical, in most cases, this just involves masking their autistic behavior in favor of presenting as something they're not. And in a lot of cases, this has very negative consequences for adults who have grown up doing this. It leads to increased anxiety, increased depression, PTSD symptoms, and increased suicidality, which is a big deal. It's not 1970 anymore. We can't bury our heads in the sand and pretend like we don't know the harm that it's doing, because we do. We have the internet, we've had it for a while. We hear autistic voices from all over the world tell us how much it sucked to have to go through that, how much it leaves consequences all the way up until adulthood. In fact, in 2018, there was a study done on like 500 autistic people who have gone through ABA as kids, and over 40% of them qualified for PTSD later in life. That's a lot. That's a lot. So things like reducing stereotypy, we know now it might be taking away a really powerful coping mechanism. So even though it makes things easier for the teacher or the classroom who doesn't have to listen to loud stimming a lot, it makes things a lot harder for our learner. And this is tragic, not just for those individuals that have been through it, but for all the ones that are not going to get to experience this trauma-informed, person-centered form of ABA that we're trying to get out there, because guess what? Less and less people are going to do ABA because they're going to think it's terrible, which sometimes, yeah, it is. And it would be really sad if we took that away from people because we bungled it up by applying it totally inappropriately. People are catching on quickly, and the importance of practicing this trauma-informed, person-centered approach to ABA is really becoming clearer by the day, because we have so much information on what childhood trauma does to adults and even typical adults. We have research showing that adverse childhood events, which can be anything from neglect to bullying to growing up in poverty to being in an accident or a natural disaster, or obviously homelessness, growing up with a parent with a mental illness, anything like that, can really increase the odds of having not only things like anxiety and depression and PTSD in adulthood, but also cancer and hepatitis and arthritis and heart disease, which is like the number one killer in the United States. And that's even after they controlled for the related things that may have increased those odds, like the fact that people who were traumatized in childhood are more likely to have lifestyles that are maybe unhealthy or use self-medication with substances or stuff like that. So even after controlling for that, they still showed that traumatic experiences in childhood severely affected adults' health. So here's the deal. Behavior science as a science is extremely effective. It's used in gerontology and environmentalism and the justice system and sports, and it works by motivating people to want to change their behavior, to learn different behavior patterns. And just because in ABA we happen to be working with children and they happen to have disabilities, and sometimes they're either compliant enough to just go through with doing things they don't want to do, or they're small enough for us to physically carry them or make them do things that they don't want to do, does not mean we get to just neglect what they want. And a lot of people to this will say, like, well, so what? Kids in the educational system in schools and stuff, they have to do stuff they don't want all the time. That doesn't make it any better. It's not a good excuse, and in fact, it's even more of a reason for why there needs to be a change. We need to make sure that what we're doing benefits our learners primarily. And as BCBAs, we're obligated by our code of ethics to only do socially valid programs. So that means that what we're working on needs to have a real life application. It needs to be important. It needs to actually make a difference. But the issue is, a lot of the time, the way that we judge this social validity is we'll ask the parents. So even in research or an application, we'll do maybe like a survey or an interview or a questionnaire to the parent and say like, hey, how'd you like this intervention? Did you think it was easy? Did you think it was effective? Did you like it? Did you blah, blah, blah? And we don't really measure this with the child themselves or with the individual themselves. So Is it really true social validity? I don't know. Probably not. We need to make sure we let our learners tell us how desirable and how acceptable an intervention is. And there are ways to do that, even with kids who don't have the communication skills to really be able to explain how they feel and what they want. If you want to know more about that, you can look up research by Dr. Hanley and his team on something called the enhanced choice model, where they let their learners vote with their feet and basically just decide if they want to do therapy or not. And in the overwhelming majority of cases, they do. Our research also needs more input from autistic people, and we need to stop pretending like they can't just open one of these journals and read what it says. And sometimes it's really jarring. I read an article by an autistic journalist who talked about how big of a hit it was to her self-acceptance and self-esteem to open up an article and read something like, "This research suggests that autistic people do have the capability for empathy or to enjoy and crave social relationships." Why are we talking about them like they came from Mars? Do better, ABA research. Another big issue in ABA for professionals in the field is the really high number of low-quality employers and low-quality clinics. A little disclaimer here, I've only worked in Texas, which arguably is the worst place in the States to do ABA because their special needs laws and regulations and all that are pretty terrible. But 75%, so 3 out of the 4 places I worked at were not places that I would send my kid. Let's put it that way. I'd kind of actually refer to them as ABA mills. They're for-profit companies that are normally run by people who are not BCBAs, don't really know what they're doing. And I'm not going to say that they were all about profits, because there definitely were people who cared about the kids, but they just didn't know what they were doing. They're providing inefficient staff training, so that leads to staff burnout. It leads to high turnover, which makes the therapy really inconsistent and unreliable. And it makes the clients not able to bond with any of the people that they work with all day, which really makes it hard for them to want to be there. And you have all these big companies mass buying out these smaller companies, creating chains that are clearly just profit-based business models. And this is a huge issue, so I'm going to cover it in a separate video because I can only let my blood pressure rise so much at one time. If you're interested in learning more about ABA reform and the direction that the field should go in, I really recommend you read a text called Today's ABA. It's by Dr. Greg Hanley, and it's I'm going to leave it in the description, the link to it. But in it, he describes that it's essential for us to really learn before we try to teach. We learn by listening to the needs of the autistic people, first of all. We learn by creating joy instead of sucking all the joy out of everything and taking it away. We have to enrich their environments and enrich their interactions and make them want to be there and want to talk to us and want to learn. And it's definitely possible. And then we learn by empowering them to make choices for themselves and by honoring those choices. And only then can we really do productive, ethical teaching. Check out some resources in the description if you want to know more about person-centered trauma-informed ABA, and let me know if you have any questions.